Imagine a world where two of the most powerful democracies on the planet, India and the United States, slide from partnership into simmering conflict. What began as strategic cooperation has now evolved into a complex web of mistrust, tariffs, and military posturing. This unraveling relationship is not happening in isolation. It reshapes the very fabric of South Asia, pushing Pakistan into an increasingly precarious position. With billions in arms deals, shifting alliances, and water disputes on the rise, the stakes have never been higher. Today, we dive deep into how this escalating U.S. India enmity could redefine regional power and threaten fragile peace. Here are 5 key reasons behind the escalating tension between India and the U.S., and how this growing rift is reshaping Pakistan's strategic landscape. These factors reveal a complex web of economic, military, and diplomatic challenges that directly impact regional stability. Reason number 1. In August of 2025, a significant inflection point emerged in the international order, though it arrived dressed in the seemingly mundane language of tariffs and trade adjustments. The United States, having grown increasingly frustrated with what it perceived as India's defiant pursuit of strategic autonomy, responded with a sweeping 50% tariff imposition on Indian exports. The measure was bifurcated. An initial 25% served as a reciprocal response to India's own trade restrictions on American tech and agricultural goods, while an additional 25% was directly tied to India's ongoing purchases of Russian crude oil amounting to over 1.9 million barrels per day by mid-2025, more than double its pre-2022 baseline. The United States justified its move as a necessary correction, a reassertion of its strategic red lines, but the implications far exceed the metrics of trade policy. India's exports to the U.S., which totaled $86.5 billion in calendar year 2025, now face a dramatic potential contraction to roughly $50 billion by the end of 2026, a 42% decrease in volume. These are not theoretical numbers. They represent the collapse of hundreds of thousands of livelihoods across critical Indian industries. The textile sector, responsible for over 45 million direct and indirect jobs, is projected to absorb more than $12 billion in lost revenue. Jewelry exports, especially gold and diamond-studded pieces, which alone account for $11.7 billion annually, could see declines north of 60%. Shrimp, one of India's largest exports to the U.S. market, faces a particularly devastating hit from $6.1 billion in 2025. The figure may fall below $3.5 billion by 2026. Carpets, handcrafted goods, and leather products, industries often tied to small artisans and regional economies, will suffer acutely. The ripple effects across supply chains will not merely dent GDP, they will exacerbate urban unemployment, deepen rural indebtedness, and introduce volatility into India's already pressured rupee, which saw a depreciation of 8.6% in just the 3 months following the announcement. Foreign direct investment inflows declined by 14% year-on-year in Q3 2025 as institutional investors reassessed India's long-term market stability under increasing geopolitical divergence from the West. But the story does not end with India's domestic pain. It radiates outward, altering the gravitational centers of regional power, with India squeezed economically by the U.S. and diplomatically cautious to avoid alignment with the West. It turns, more out of necessity than ideology, toward Moscow and Beijing. Joint military exercises with Russia in the Bay of Bengal in September 2025, and an unprecedented energy security pact with China in October signal a new arc of cooperation that could reshape Asian power dynamics for the decade to come. This shift carries profound implications for Pakistan. For decades, Pakistan has navigated a precarious strategic triangle, balancing U.S. defense aid, Chinese investment, and antagonism with India. But as India deepens its engagement with Russia and China, two of Islamabad's closest partners, the diplomatic space in which Pakistan can maneuver begins to constrict. U.S. officials, wary of further alienating India, may deprioritize Pakistan's regional concerns, including its plea for third-party mediation on Kashmir and objections to India's water diversion projects in the disputed Jammu region. Already, Pakistan has seen a 23% drop in U.S. military assistance since 2023 and a near-complete halt to bilateral trade talks. Economically, the consequences are also non-trivial. With India pulling away from Western markets and reconfiguring supply chains to include Russia and Central Asia, Pakistan risks being bypassed entirely. The International North-South Transport Corridor (INST), an alternative trade route connecting Russia, Iran, and India, has gained renewed momentum in 2025, reducing dependency on routes that pass through Pakistan. Trade loss projections for Pakistan's regional transit routes stand at over $1.2 billion annually by 2027 if the current pattern continues. What emerges, then, is not merely a trade rift between two large economies, but a structural shift in regional hierarchies. The old order, shaped by post-9/11 security cooperation and WTO-era global trade consensus, is giving way to something far more unstable, defined not by common rules but by strategic autonomy, energy hedging, and the transactional logic of survival. For Pakistan, the risk is existential. Diminished diplomatic leverage, sidelined economic relevance, and encroaching regional isolation, all triggered by a decision that, on the surface, was about shrimp, textiles, and tariffs, but in truth was about much more. Reason number 2: on August 29, 2025, a moment unfolded that, while barely registering on the broader Western public's radar, marked a critical inflection point in the geopolitical architecture of South and Central Asia. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, after a 7-year absence, traveled to China to meet President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin in the coastal city of Tianjin, a quiet, almost symbolic convergence that belied its geopolitical weight. To the casual observer, it was a diplomatic trip. To those who understand the mechanisms of power, it was the signal of a tectonic recalibration. India, under sustained economic and diplomatic pressure from the United States, is no longer simply hedging. It is beginning to pivot. This development is not an isolated event. It must be understood within a matrix of deeper strategic alignments and misalignments. India's overt engagement with the BRICS Plus bloc, which, as of 2025, has expanded to include Iran, Egypt, Argentina, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, is emblematic of this larger strategic diversification. Within the BRICS framework, India sees an opportunity to escape the Western-dominated financial and diplomatic consensus, which increasingly views New Delhi's actions, particularly its continued purchase of over 2 million barrels per day of Russian crude, as incompatible with the so-called rules-based order. But here's the thing: that order is cracking, and India knows it. By doubling down on BRICS, India is positioning itself not merely as a regional counterweight to China, but as a co-steward of an emerging economic bloc whose collective GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity, now exceeds that of the G7 by nearly $5 trillion. With intra-BRICS trade expected to cross the $1 trillion mark by the end of 2025, and with new digital currency frameworks under experimentation in Brazil and China, the bloc increasingly appears as an alternative pole of global finance, one where India does not need to play second fiddle to the United States or the European Union. And this, precisely, is where the strategic dilemma begins for Pakistan. For decades, Pakistan has depended on its iron brother relationship with China as both a counterbalance to Indian regional dominance and a foundation for its economic vision, particularly under the $62 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC). But if India begins to find common ground with China, based on realpolitik interests such as trade, energy, and collective resistance to Western pressure, then the calculus begins to change. The premise of a simple bipolar rivalry collapses. Pakistan is then no longer China's indispensable regional partner, but merely one of its several interlocutors, perhaps useful but no longer strategic in a zero-sum sense. This potential sidelining is already observable. Chinese investment in Pakistan under the Belt and Road Initiative has slowed, dropping from $4.7 billion in 2021 to just $1.3 billion in 2024, while Beijing's direct trade with India rose by 12.6% in the first half of 2025 alone, reaching $68.9 billion despite skirmishes and disagreements. At the same time, Indian participation in the BRICS Development Bank gives it access to lending tools previously leveraged primarily by Pakistan and its allies. India is now lobbying within BRICS to establish its own cross-border payment settlement system, a competitor to SWIFT, using a rupee yuan mechanism. Such systems could marginalize Pakistan's influence within the broader Global South financial dialogue. And there's a more subtle psychological shift occurring as well. As India engages both Xi and Putin while remaining a democracy, be it an embattled and imperfect one, it positions itself as a model for multipolar cooperation without ideological allegiance. Pakistan, by contrast, risks being perceived as locked into one axis with diminished ability to maneuver diplomatically. When strategic flexibility disappears, influence soon follows. This new triangle, India, Russia, China, carries with it uncomfortable implications. Pakistan's relevance as a bridge between East and West is no longer guaranteed. Its strategic depth, once considered vital, now seems negotiable. Its assumed leverage in forums like the OIC, SCO, or even the UN General Assembly may wane as India rebrands itself not only as a rising power, but as a reconciler among ancient giants. And when that happens, when alliances born of necessity give way to partnerships born of vision, the strategic margins collapse. Pakistan must now grapple with a regional order in which its primary adversary is no longer isolated but increasingly networked. That's not just a shift, that's a reckoning. Reason number 3: on April 23, 2025, in the immediate aftermath of a terrorist bombing in Pahalgam that left 42 civilians and Indian security personnel dead, a long-standing diplomatic pillar of South Asian stability collapsed. India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, a landmark 1960 agreement brokered by the World Bank that had, for over 6 decades, survived wars, border skirmishes, and political upheavals between two nuclear-armed neighbors. The treaty governed the distribution and management of the Indus River system, a lifeline that feeds 90% of Pakistan's agriculture, sustains over 240 million people across the two nations, and irrigates 80% of Pakistan's total arable land. This was not a minor adjustment or bureaucratic delay. It was unilateral suspension. India halted flows on the Chenab River, one of the 3 western rivers guaranteed to Pakistan under the agreement, and conducted off-season reservoir flushing, a technical maneuver that reduces Pakistan's seasonal irrigation capacity by as much as 22%. The symbolism was immediate, but the strategic implications are far more enduring. Water, once a shared resource, had now become an instrument of coercion, weaponized not with the overt blast of artillery, but with the silent withholding of rivers. Pakistan's response was equally revealing. On August 9, 2025, during a black tie event attended by senior U.S. defense officials in Tampa, Florida, Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff General Asim Munir issued an unprecedented public threat. If India were to construct any future dam capable of altering Pakistan's water supply, he stated, "We will destroy it with 10 missiles before its first turbine spins." This was not just rhetorical posturing. It was strategic signaling of the highest order, drawing a straight line from India's water policies to potential nuclear escalation, a threat tethered not to ideology or political narrative, but to existential survival. Pakistan is one of the most water-stressed nations on Earth. As of 2025, its per capita water availability has dropped below 850 cubic meters, far beneath the global water scarcity threshold of 1,000. This decline is not theoretical. Agricultural output from the Punjab and Sindh provinces, regions nourished by the Indus and its tributaries, has already contracted by 17% year-over-year in 2024 due to reduced snowmelt and delayed monsoons. An additional 20% reduction, as projected by the Pakistan Meteorological Department in light of Indian upstream interference, could tip Pakistan into widespread food insecurity. Wheat yields could fall by 6 million tons. Sugarcane production, already under pressure from fuel and fertilizer shortages, might collapse by 30%. Inflation, driven by food scarcity, has already touched 29% year-on-year. In a country where over 38% of the population lives below the poverty line, this is not a policy concern. It is a national emergency. But the danger lies not only in the drying of fields or empty reservoirs. It lies in what follows. When water disappears, states do not simply file protests at the UN. They reconfigure their threat perceptions, they alter their red lines, strategic doctrines, especially those written in opaque terms like Pakistan's full-spectrum deterrence, begin to move from abstraction to application. The notion that a dam can be equated to a missile site, that a river's blockage could justify preemptive strikes, is no longer a theoretical debate among defense analysts. It becomes military planning, it becomes national posture, and in a region where both India and Pakistan maintain nuclear arsenals, with delivery systems capable of reaching each other's capitals in under 12 minutes, the line between posturing and provocation is terrifyingly thin. The collapse of the Indus Waters Treaty removes not just a legal safeguard, but a psychological buffer, a shared rulebook amid hostility. Without it, every dam becomes a potential flashpoint. Every glacier's melt becomes a political dispute. Every seasonal drought turns into a perceived act of sabotage. This is not merely the weaponization of water, it is the corrosion of the very assumptions that have, however tenuously, held the subcontinent back from catastrophe. And so the world watches, not with urgency, perhaps, but it should. Because when rivers become weapons and treaties become dead letters, the future does not unfold in peace talks. It rushes forward with the logic of desperation. And in that logic, where survival becomes the only acceptable outcome, even the unimaginable becomes thinkable. Reason number 4 in the structure of international relations, as in life itself, hierarchies form not merely out of desire or ideology, but out of capacity, out of who possesses what and who does not. And nowhere is this more visceral, more primal than in military affairs. On the surface, the recent reports of India entering advanced negotiations with the United States for the procurement of F-35 fifth-generation fighter jets may appear as just another line in the spreadsheet of global arms deals. But beneath that innocuous phrasing lies an evolution with transformative, and possibly existential, consequences for the regional balance of power in South Asia. The F-35 is not just an aircraft. It is an aerial ecosystem stealth-enabled multirole, capable network, integrated and backed by real-time battlefield awareness. With over 400 internal sensors and 8 million lines of software code, it provides full-spectrum dominance in air, sea, and land combat theaters. A single F-35 squadron is capable of conducting electronic warfare, surveillance, and deep strike missions simultaneously. If acquired, India would become the first South Asian nation with true fifth-generation air power, leapfrogging Pakistan's entire aerial infrastructure, which still largely depends on the aging F-16s, the JF-17 Thunder co-developed with China, and a handful of legacy Mirage Roman 3 and Mirage V platforms. India's defense budget now stands at an estimated $81.2 billion in 2025, an increase of nearly 8.5% from the previous year, making it the third largest defense spender globally, behind only the United States and China. Pakistan, by contrast, allocates just $10.3 billion annually to defense. That figure is not only a fraction of India's outlay, it also comes under increasing domestic pressure due to economic instability, inflation nearing 30%, and foreign debt repayments exceeding $125 billion. The discrepancy is not just fiscal, it is systemic. While India runs multiple active defense technology partnerships with France, Israel, the U.S., and Russia, Pakistan remains heavily dependent on Chinese platforms and limited indigenous development. The implications are severe. If India acquires the F-35, it renders Pakistan surfaced, where missile systems, based on decades-old Soviet and Chinese designs, largely obsolete. The jet's radar cross-section is smaller than a metal golf ball. It's designed to be invisible to legacy radar. This means that even Pakistan's premier radar systems like the LY-80 or HQ-9, which form the backbone of its medium and long-range air defense, would struggle to detect, let alone track or intercept, an inbound F-35 sortie. This shifts the logic of deterrence. Historically, South Asian stability has depended on a delicate form of mutual vulnerability, especially in the nuclear realm. Pakistan's nuclear doctrine is built around full-spectrum deterrence. a strategy intended to offset India's conventional superiority by keeping all conflict threshold, tactical, operational, and strategic linked to the threat of nuclear escalation. But deterrence does not work in a vacuum. It requires credibility, and credibility comes from the perception that one can retaliate effectively. If Pakistan cannot maintain air superiority or defend its nuclear assets from precision strikes, something the F-35 would be designed to do, then the entire doctrine begins to lose strategic coherence. And this is not merely a hypothetical. India has already inducted over 36 Dassault Rafale jets from France, equipped with Meteor Beyond Visual, range air-to-air missiles and Scalp cruise missiles capable of striking deep into Pakistani territory. With the F-35, this capability enters a new dimension. It becomes not just a threat of retaliation, but one of disarmament, an aerial sword hanging over Islamabad's deterrent infrastructure. So what happens when imbalance becomes dominance? When the ladder of escalation is no longer even on both sides, the answer is not peace, it is desperation, desperation that drives preemptive thinking, desperation that incentivizes asymmetric tactics, desperation that breaks down the very predictability on which nuclear peace depends. In a world where technology decides who holds the moral and military high ground, Pakistan finds itself inching toward strategic irrelevance. And when a nation begins to suspect that it can no longer defend itself by conventional means, it does not disarm, it doubles down, it abandons balance and seeks risk. That is not stability, that is a countdown. A subtle, quiet one, but a countdown nonetheless. Reason number 5, there's a peculiar kind of instability that doesn't come from confrontation, but from contradiction, from the subtle draw, now erosion of clarity. Strategic ambiguity, in this sense, is not a sign of creative diplomacy. It's a sign of indecision disguised as design, and in South Asia's ever-volatile balance of power, it functions less as a stabilizing force and more as a corrosive element, one that chips away at the confidence of allies and emboldens adversaries. Nowhere is this more evident than in the United States' current approach to Pakistan under the designation of major non-NATO ally Menene, even as it simultaneously courts India with increasing fervor and strategic indulgence. As of 2025, Pakistan remains on the short list of 18 nations to hold a Menene status, an arrangement first granted in 2004 during the post-9/11 security alignment. The designation offers certain military and financial privileges, eligibility for cooperative defense research, expedited arms sales, and access to U.S. surplus military equipment. Over the past 2 decades, this has translated into billions of dollars in foreign military financing, FMF, logistics support, and counterterrorism training. And yet, for all its structural benefits, the status today operates in a vacuum, untethered from real strategic commitment. The United States continues to deepen its partnership with India across virtually every domain of hard and soft power. Bilateral trade between the two nations reached $196 billion in 2025, a record high. Defense cooperation has expanded dramatically, with the U.S. now India's largest supplier of advanced surveillance drones, missile defense systems, and, as of late 2025, the green-lighted sale of 24 F-35A Lightning Roman II fighter jets. U.S. India joint military exercises have grown in both scope and frequency, with the 2025 iteration of Tiger Triumph, involving over 15,000 troops and full-spectrum joint naval operations in the Bay of Bengal. The Defense Technology and Trade Initiative DTTI now involves co-production of next-generation munitions and AI-powered targeting systems, areas from which Pakistan is completely excluded, but the contradiction becomes especially sharp during moments of crisis. During Operation Sindoor, launched by India in June 2025, following a border provocation in Ladakh, the United States publicly refrained from engaging Pakistan diplomatically, neither offering mediation nor issuing formal statements urging restraint from both sides. Instead, U.S. State Department briefings offered carefully curated phrases reaffirming India's right to defend its territorial integrity, while merely encouraging regional stability. Pakistan, sensing the abandonment, recalled its envoy from Washington for the first time in 12 years. This is what strategic ambiguity does. It produces a situation in which formal alliances coexist with informal alienation. Pakistan receives MNNA status, but without political reliability. It is still eligible for military hardware, but receives none of the strategic assurances that once accompanied such designations. In 2025, total U.S. security assistance to Pakistan fell below $175 million, the lowest in over 20 years, while over $5.7 billion in arms and defense services were committed to India during the same period. The material asymmetry is staggering, but the diplomatic asymmetry is worse. For Pakistan, the problem is not simply being second in line, it's being on a list that no longer seems to matter. An MNNA designation, in theory, should act as a leverage point in bilateral and multilateral negotiations. It should offer weight in forums like the United Nations, the IMF, and the Financial Action Task Force. But when the designation becomes performative, when Washington's military, industrial complex flows billions to a rival without condition while extending silence or symbolic aid to an ally, it sends a very different message, one of transactionalism. This kind of ambiguity degrades trust, it erodes the legitimacy of the bilateral relationship, and limits Pakistan's ability to maneuver diplomatically. It complicates crisis management because Islamabad cannot accurately predict whether Washington will intervene, remain neutral, or quietly support New Delhi. And in an environment where strategic calculus depends on predictability, on knowing whether an ally will pick up the phone when the first shots are fired, ambiguity becomes a threat in itself. Allies that don't know where they stand cannot plan. They cannot deter, they cannot negotiate from a position of strength, and eventually they stop asking for clarity and start preparing for abandonment. What the United States must confront, if it wishes to maintain any meaningful influence in South Asia, is this: that when commitment is diluted by convenience and alliances are reduced to bureaucratic formalities, the structure that once ensured regional restraint begins to crack. And when those cracks reach the foundation, when ambiguity becomes the norm, what follows is not diplomacy but desperation. The world stands at a crossroads where the delicate balance between cooperation and confrontation teeters on the edge of uncertainty. As India and the U.S. navigate their complex, sometimes contradictory relationship, Pakistan finds itself caught in an unprecedented strategic squeeze economically, politically, and militarily. The future of South Asia hinges not on rivalry alone but on the choices these nations make now. Will diplomacy prevail, or will escalation become the new norm? The answers will reverberate far beyond borders, shaping global security for decades. In this high-stakes game, peace is the prize, and its cost is too great to ignore.